Mr. President, Mr. President,
is there objection? Who addresses
Mr. President,
the senator from Massachusetts?
Mr. President, I don't want to object to that, but I'd like to be able to get 4 minutes, perhaps prior to.
It had been an unremarkable afternoon on the Senate floor in the summer of 1987 when the usual proceedings were disrupted by Ted Kennedy, who had been waiting for his moment to pounce.
And the senator from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. President, I oppose the nomination of Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, and I urge the Senate to reject it.
Robert Bork, a conservative judge who was favored by the hard right, had just been nominated to the Supreme Court by President Reagan. Less than an hour after the president's announcement, Kennedy was on his feet, delivering what's now known as the Robert Bork's America speech.
Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, and school children could not be taught about evolution.
It was a blistering attack. Even some Democrats thought he went too far. Kennedy would lead the charge in Senate hearings, and Bork's nomination was rejected. The episode would establish Kennedy as the liberal lion of the U.S. Senate. 4 years later, another conservative nominee came along, Clarence Thomas, and this time the public would see a very different Kennedy, particularly when it came to a former employee of Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill. Hill had come forward to testify that Thomas had sexually harassed her at work.
He wanted to see me vulnerable, and that if I were vulnerable, then he could extract from me whatever he wanted, whether it was sexual or otherwise.
Thomas denied it. Republican senators challenged Hill, portraying her as a woman spurned, a liar. Her natural ally would have been Ted Kennedy, who had become a champion of women's rights. But on the first day of the hearings, when Kennedy tried to speak up, he was promptly shut down by a Republican senator.
Well, what am I missing here, Professor Hill?
The witness speak in her own words rather than having words put in her mouth.
Mr. Chairman, I object to that. I object to that vociferously. I'm asking questions here. If Senator Kennedy has anything to say, let him participate in this hearing.
Now, let it. Everybody calm down.
I think there were a lot of people who were disappointed. Here is someone who has been so outspoken and so well-spoken in the past, and he put himself in the position of allowing people like Arlen Specter to silence him.
Kennedy barely participated in the hearings. How had the loudest voice on the left been silenced? As the Thomas hearings were unfolding, Kennedy's mind was elsewhere. This time it was the senators' turn to answer questions.
Good afternoon.
Would you please state your full name for the record?
It's Edward Bork Kennedy.
He was called as a witness in a rape trial in Palm Beach. Kennedy had been on vacation in Florida the previous spring. According to his testimony, he had woken up his son and nephew one night to go for drinks at a pickup spot called O-Bar. 2 women came back to the Kennedy compound with the men, and by the end of the night, Kennedy's nephew had been accused of rape. Broadcast live, the trial was watched by millions. His nephew was acquitted, but Kennedy's testimony revealed an unseemly side of the senator.
I wish I'd gone for a long walk on the beach instead, but we did go to O-Bar.
Since his divorce in 1982, tabloids and gossip columns had chronicled Kennedy's drinking sprees and his romantic flings. In one of the most embarrassing episodes, he was photographed on top of a woman in a motorboat off the French Riviera.
You know, it's really hard to live your life when you're stalked.
Former aide Melody Miller was working for Kennedy at the time.
I mean, he'd be in the middle of nowhere with a friend on the boat, and they'd have a close-up photo in the National Enquirer the next week, and you know, how did that happen? I mean, I was way out to sea. There was nobody around. He was an attractive man. He was a Kennedy. There were groupies just like for a rock star or a Robert Redford. I mean, women just followed him.
During the 1980s, Kennedy's personal adventures crept into the public sphere, overshadowing the battles he waged in Congress and in judicial nomination hearings.
It really did come to a head in those hearings. This disconnect between many of the principles that he had espoused publicly and the things that he had allegedly done personally. If you really care, you better live it. And if you don't, if you're not willing to live it, then someone's going to come around and point out that you're a hypocrite.
I'm painfully aware that the criticism directed at me involves far more than honest disagreement with my positions.
Within weeks of the Thomas hearings, Kennedy delivered a public apology.
It also involves the disappointment of friends and many others who rely on me to fight the good fight. To them I say I recognize my own shortcomings, the faults in the conduct of my private life. I realize that I alone am responsible for them, and I am the one who must confront them.
In the early 1990s, Kennedy cleaned up his private life. He married Vicki Reggie, a Washington lawyer and divorced mother of two, who would have a remarkably calming effect on the senator. His constituents took note. Among them, Anita Hill, now a Massachusetts resident.
I did consider the fact that Senator Kennedy was going to be my senator. I thought about the hearings. That was part of the consideration. But I also thought about all the other things that I believe he stands for. It's not that I don't think that the personal behavior is important, but I also think that there has been a change. He's still out there. He's still working toward equality. I think his personal choices have been different, and that's enough.